Okay, this section is risk management with new ventures. And we are working risk management into every facet of this program that we're doing. And you will see that risk management is something that once you learn about it, you will think about it at every turn when you make a change or when you start something. So one thing I did want to get into a little bit here is local, regional, state, and federal regulations. We're going to do a deep dive today with some regulations later on in the program. But I did want to talk about some of the regulations that you might not think about when you're getting going on your business. There are local regulations that can affect your business. And even though farms mostly are exempt from some regulations, it's worth it to check because not every town in the state of New York or anywhere always exempts farms, because when you get into processing a product and not, even though you might have the raw product also on the farm, the category changes from agriculture to processing. It's also changes the way you file your income tax returns. We'll get to that later on, but as far as building permits and zoning, you must familiarize yourself with the laws that apply to your enterprise. Like with the milk processing on the farm, if I could just use an example, or making the ice cream, the raw product, of course, from agriculture is the milk, but ice cream is a processed product. So it's taking that raw product and then complying with the laws and regulations. You would start your processing center. So you will note later on when we are talking with Ag and Markets today that they will illuminate us on all the permits and things that you may need. Your local planning and zoning boards are critical to work with them and make sure that you have all the permits or variances in place. And ignorance is no excuse. You know, well, I didn't know. Well, you didn't check. So I did want to use this farm brewery example because it's local here in Delaware County, and we felt really bad, you know, that they started up as a hop farm and then they sort of morphed to a tasting room, and then after a while it became a real entertainment place, and they were serving food and things, and they got shut down because they were not in a zone. They were in an agricultural zone, but they were not in a zone, an area zoned for commercial enterprises. And so it cost them a lot of money. You know, it's a place where friends of ours go with us, and we felt bad that they had not approached the zoning board. So they did work it out, I guess, eventually, but it just took time and money. And that's the other thing, you know, they had to get some legal help. So it's just one of those things that you want to avoid. So work with your town clerk, find out what the regulations are. Most towns have a printed or online version of their regulations. In our town, we have zoning regulations, we have sign ordinances, we have noise ordinances. So just keep it in mind. We are going to talk a little bit today about liability. A few of you mentioned bringing people to the farm, and I'm just going to make a side note here before I forget about it. We did a risk in agritourism ventures a couple of years ago, and maybe it was last year, but all of the presentations are on our YouTube, on our website at our YouTube channel. It's ccedelaware.org. So if any of you are doing agritourism ventures, we did 5 sessions on this, and they're 1-hour presentations. or a little more. So it's worth a look if you are doing agritourism. But I'm not going to go into depth on all the agritourism things in this session, but you will get an in-depth education from those YouTubes, and you can just do them when you get a chance. But anyway, premise liability is when a property owner fails to protect people from potentially hazardous conditions. The minute you invite people to your farm with a sign or a farm stand, you're inviting them to your farm, they're stepping out of their vehicles, and they are buying something from you or doing an activity on your farm, you are getting into the premise liability arena. Product liability is when you have a product. It could also be a service, and it somehow injures someone. A food that might be spoiled or does not have the proper label, and somebody is allergic to whatever was in there. It's just an example. Property damage, damage to property of the customer by the business. Maybe somebody pulls off onto your farm stand and the tractor hits the car. You know, that could happen. It does happen. Personal liability, when a business provides a service that causes personal harm. There has to be harm here. You know, when you're talking about liability, you're always liable, but there has to be a harm that comes to someone. And then, of course, when you have employees, you have to determine their status. Are they an employee? Are they a contractor? Have they been trained? Are you paying them according to the legal standards? So these are this is just a quick, these are kinds of liability that you can get into when you have a new business, and you can kind of see what applies to your business. Having visitors on your property, how to determine liabilities. You need to use the reasonable care approach. It requires you to exercise reasonable care in any situation. And what that means is people are always going to get hurt in one way, shape, or form, but have you done everything that you could to prevent that? If you have a lot of potholes, your insurance carrier is going to go over these things with you, and he or she is going to say, I am not going to insure you until you fix your driveway. This does get into insurance, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But if somebody wanders from the farm stand to other parts of your farm and you have signage that says, you know, closed, or you've cordoned off the area, but they went under the rope. We have people who have vegetable farms and say that people will go out into their farms and pick the vegetables instead of taking the ones at the farm stand. They want to pick them. And the minute they leave the safety of the farm stand, you know, they could fall into a woodchuck hole, you know. So we have to just use reasonable care, and signage is part of that. Status equals duty approach. The duty of the landowner varies according to the status of the injured person and the relationship to the landowner at the time of the injury. There are different types of status, whether a person is a trespasser, a licensee, an invitee, a social guest, or a recreational user. So the status of the person is important. If you're closed and somebody comes and they get hurt because you weren't open and didn't have the light on and they tripped, the status changes because they weren't invited at that time. But we'll get to that in a little bit more detail. So some terminology to become familiar with, even if you aren't having someone come to the farm, liability is everywhere. It's with your product, it's with your service, and you have to transfer that liability to an insurance company and then do all you can to minimize that. So some terminology that we use when we're talking about liability is duty of care. You have to take care of your customer. Your responsibilities as a landowner are different in different situations. They use the reasonable person standard, but sometimes I find that reasonable person standard really can vary. When people come to a farm or a business and they're unfamiliar and you haven't educated them with signage, they might not realize that animal in the field can bite, or the fence is electric and they can get a shock. So sometimes we have to use, they're not all reasonable people. They don't understand farms. They haven't been educated. So we have to go beyond what we would normally do and not assume that people understand. So your duty of care changes with the type of person. And if you have children coming to an agricultural venture, or if you're working with children in any way, shape, or form, children are people who need to be protected the most. So your duty of care changes. You can have a breach of duty, which is a failure on your part regarding your responsibilities. You can have a causation. It's your failure that caused the injury, and there must be actual harm. Somebody can say, well, there's a huge pothole that I almost fell into. Well, if they didn't fall into it, they didn't get harmed. But if they do fall into it and twist their ankle, they did get harmed. So it's just not thinking about those things that that would cause you some liability. So there are three categories of people if you are bringing them to you. Trespassers, which you give the lowest duty of care. They're actually harming you. So you don't have to worry if somebody's trespassing and there's an electric fence that they get shocked at. They're trespassing. A licensee is someone who you invite to the farm like an electrician. And you want to make sure that everything is safe for them to do the work. But as a professional, they are somewhat responsible for themselves. But your invitee is the highest duty of care. Whoever that person is, you are inviting them to your farm or to your farm stand or to your business, and you have to make sure that they are protected. Now, the status of the person on your land can also change fluidly and suddenly. If you allow someone to fish in your pond, but they explore other parts of your land, they may change from an invitee to a trespasser. But if you catch them and accept money for their access to the parts of the land, then they become an invitee. The minute that money changes hands, it goes from trespasser to an invitee. Then all of a sudden, you're liable. And if you don't have liability coverage for invitees, you need to get it. It's important to clearly define the area that visitors have permission to use. So I have spoken with some of the bigger farm stands in the area, and they try not to be rude, but they have signage, which is not just words, it's pictures. It's something that a child can understand. And in the agritourism videos on YouTube, it just goes into all that. So you can always do a deeper dive on that. So what is negligence? I always think that people are falling into rabbit holes, So I really like that picture of Alice. But anyway, the failure to exercise the care that a reasonably prudent person would exercise in like circumstances. So you have to be found negligent before you can't, before somebody can sue you. For an example, a property owner fails to protect people from potentially hazardous conditions. And that could consist of chemicals, electric fencing, holes, hazardous walking, slippery floors, and a customer is injured on the premises. So examples are slips, trips, falls, equipment injury, animal or human contact injury. So if you remember those words we used before, you have a duty. If there is a breach and a causation plus damages, that means you've been negligent. So the big thing is not to be negligent in any way. And if you engage an insurance professional to come and look at your venture, they will also give you a lot of guidelines for eliminating much of the risk. The other thing we want to do with insurance is we want to transfer that risk to the insurance company. And you pay a premium for that. Product liability. We'll talk more about it later, but it's, obviously when someone becomes ill after consuming a food that was prepared, if you are doing a food venture. Foreign object in food, undeclared allergens, spoiled food. What about employees? Employers are responsible for their actions. Is the person working on the farm an employee or an independent contractor? You have to make that distinction. Employees need training to recognize, mitigate, and report risks and hazards. Post and implement employee rules and regulations, and incorporate workers' comp. So keep the business and its products safe for customers and employees. Select the proper business structure. Transfer the risk to an insurance company. Understand and comply with the federal, state, local laws, regulations, codes. Keep the use of waivers. Consider the use of waivers for visitors, and that's taken up in the agritourism stuff too. Keep good records and maintain appropriate insurance. So identify any exposures with your business, and you can talk to your insurance company about that. Evaluate any loss potential that you might have. Select your method of protection, implement the selected method, and then it just, every time something changes, go back and do this again. So I didn't want to spend too much more time on that. Not everybody will incur every kind of thing that we talked about, but I did want to make sure that Nichole had some time before our break. We might not have a big long break, but we'll try to make it up at the next hour. But Nichole, I can turn it over to you.